Welcome back to another YouTube video. And what I want to talk about today is the top 3 reasons your peaking block goes wrong. And to precede this, I recently did a 3-part series encapsulating everything involving peaking on Powerlifting Now. I think there was over 5 hours of content regarding that. And that really dives into everything on a lift-by-lift basis, tapering protocols, setting up peaking blocks, looking at different type of peaking strategies based on different lifters, breaking down kind of how to write a peaking block, looking at case studies. That is the full encapsulation of that. But I wanted to make this shorter YouTube video kind of based on that series, specifically on what I really see as the main 3 reasons I see peaking blocks going wrong for athletes, especially ones who are being programmed more in a way that probably more aligns with kind of how I do things. Not so much if, oh, you're just completely taking a week off leading in the meet, or like ultra 1980s periodization style. Like, you have a base of modern day programming, and here are the things even within that you're likely doing wrong and why things are not going as planned. And this is not top 3 reasons why your peak doesn't go well, it's why your peaking block doesn't go well. So this is preceding the actual taper. That's again, I dive into that within the actual series I did on Powerlifting Now, but we're not talking about that. We're gonna talk about the actual peaking block, the actual training not going as planned, because we see that very often. You hear so many times people talking about in their peaking block how they just feel like they're dead. There's extra aches and pains that are occurring. Strength is going down. Fatigue is much higher than it usually is. And it just feels different than a normal block. And while to an extent it should, as you are going to be doing some things different than you would do during a normal block, it shouldn't be vastly different. And if you're feeling vastly different, and strength is down, you're feeling way more beat up than usual, it's because there's some things that you're doing that are too different from what you normally do that works really, really well. And so within this video and within the series I did on Powerlifting Now, things I repeated over and over and over is the overriding reason peaking doesn't go well for most people is they do things differently from what actually works most of the year. But I want to pinpoint 3 specific things that I see as being the main reasons I see the peaking block and the actual training within the peaking before the taper going wrong. Because I can't tell you how many people I see through Instagram and whatnot and following, especially with 2 White Lights preview shows and whatnot and seeing their training, how many people hit these huge lifts like 2-3 blocks out, and the peaking block, everything just goes to shambles. And I even know sometimes too exactly what's going to happen because I know the style of the coach or how the athlete has typically peaked before, and looking at how they're actually doing things, that they're posting the lifts they're doing and the actual sets and reps for the day, and I can just tell exactly what's happening. And it a lot of times boils down to these 3 reasons. And those are: 1, you're overly changing or periodizing your secondary day, whether squat, bench, or deadlift. Number 2, you're changing the average intensity of your rep work too much from what you normally do towards what you're doing during the peaking block. And then number 3, you're hitting higher absolute and or relative intensities earlier in the block than you typically do in a regular block within your normal progression rate. So without further ado, let's get right on into it so I can really kind of break down and show what do I mean by overly periodizing your secondary day, or changing rep work average intensity too much, or having higher intensities earlier in the block than you normally do. So let's kind of go through it, and so I can kind of show you this idea of where people are going wrong. So first, and probably maybe the most common I see is people overly changing and periodizing their secondary day. So as I mentioned, just in general, the overriding thing that I mentioned in the entire Powerlifting Now series is people tend to change too much. But the secondary day in particular is where I see a lot of people go wrong. And I've talked to multiple coaches too, and people I think are great coaches. And when I talk to them about where they're feeling like they need some improvement within peaking, I've seen a lot where the secondary day and how they change that is where they're going wrong. So your secondary day, it's an issue if your secondary day is notably different from what you've done in blocks prior that went very well. So this could be all encompassing that you were overly changing or periodizing the program as a whole. That's an issue altogether. But specifically, I've seen time and time again that over periodization of secondary days ruins peaking blocks and kind of how your normal strength progression and output is. And I think most lifters probably could get away from over periodizing their primary day, even though that could be an issue too. And it's more so the secondary day I seem to be a really big issue, because what typically happens is the setup that primes your main day gets overly changed to where you now feel terrible on the day you're supposed to be the strongest and hitting heavier weights. I just made a post actually on Instagram about secondary days and kind of a general flow chart of kind of how you might be feeling and how to adjust. The guys from TSP just did a post about why the secondary day is so important, but you're using that secondary day to set up that primary day. So if it's overly changing, you're gonna get a different response. So example being, and to an extent, I'm gonna over exaggerate so it can prove my point, or not prove my point necessarily, but show my point. Here's an example of common block periodization. You have a secondary day, we're just gonna do squat for example, a secondary day with a top set of 5 followed by 2x8, and then the primary day is 4s. And then every single block, everything kind of drops a little bit. You go 4, 3, 2, 1, 5, 4, 3, 2, 8, 7, 6, 5, and then we have a little bit of a change here since it's a single, you have a 3x3 here. So either way, the issue here is with a lot of lifters, this is so different from this, especially when in regards to this secondary day. This is such a big difference in the absolute intensity, the weight on the bar, the total volume on the day. I can't tell you how many times I see lifters that like maybe these two blocks feel amazing. Like this is the sweet spot within this macro cycle as a whole. This maybe is too much volume, and then this is too little, just for example. But we periodize down, and then we wonder why all of a sudden these singles feel terrible when we're doing a double and a set of 2x5, when normally we feel best doing a set of 4 and a 2x7, which is notably more volume and then lower weight. And there's a lot of differences of what's going to happen of how you feel on this day doing this secondary day versus here. So an example of how we could update this, and specifically just the secondary day, because I'm not going to periodize or change what I'm doing on the primary day. We're going to use the same exact model, which the assumption is that yes, maybe the primary day could be over periodized, but the bigger issue is when the secondary day gets over periodized. So as noted in detail in the peaking series, I likely wouldn't periodize the primary day in this manner. I'd do something different, but just using this as an example of how the secondary day alone changes can make a major difference. And I think, frankly, if your issue is that you're really sputtering out, this probably would solve it for a lot of people. Just in this example is, like I said, there's a good chance these two blocks are going really, really well, and then you sputter out here where now this day doesn't feel very good, everything feels really heavy, you're getting more fatigued. Well, in that case, just keep repeating this setup here, 1x4, 2x7, 1x3, 2x6. Instead of periodizing down, repeat it again into these final blocks so that this day stays pretty consistent. You're not overly trying to push this day, you're not trying to overly periodize it or change it, you're trying to use this day to prime this day. And so therefore you could go ahead and periodize this in the typical manner, but keep this day more consistent to help prime this day. And you're probably going to find that that primary day now on that peaking block doesn't have as much variability as if you did some type of setup like this. As well as another thing, this is going to kind of go back to some things we're going to talk about on changing rep work and then intensities early in the block, is how often people change the progression model on a secondary day during a peaking block. Like all of a sudden now we need to go heavier because it's a peaking block. And just for example, let's say your typical secondary setup is the top set of 3 followed by 2x6. And then your normal progression, just using RPE as the example, is week 1 at 5 to 6 RPE on the top set. I'm not going to really go too heavily deep into the 2x6 here, but just let's say the top set. Week 2 is at 6 RPE, week 3 is 6 to 7, week 4 is 7. That's your normal progression model. But then you say in the peaking block, we need to hit heavier weights. We need to hit these higher absolute intensities for the physiological effects of motor threshold recruitment and force production and all this kind of stuff. And you have all these reasonings for it. But sometimes those reasonings kind of don't have to go out the wall for the reason that we're satisfying a lot of those elements maybe on this primary day, but the secondary day needs to prime that main day. And so what happens is a person goes 5, 6, 7, 8, they're decently changing the progression model. They're going heavier on their secondary day than they normally do, even if they are keeping it consistent in the general setup. And then they wonder again, why does my primary day feel bad? So keeping that secondary day consistent, finding what works and not periodizing too far away from that is very, very key in helping that peaking block to go as planned, just like most of your normal training throughout the year goes. Next up is changing rep work average intensity too much. And this can go a multitude of different ways. So it's very common to see the over prioritization of singles once we get to a peaking block, and we see the rep work setup decently change from an average intensity perspective. So what I mean by that is too often we see a peaking block be the first time within the entire macro cycle that singles are prioritized the degree they are, and that changes the general layout of sometimes how you're programming the general structure. And if you prioritize singles year round and make them the foundation of your general programming system, this won't be as much of an issue, at least in this point. So assuming, though, the large majority of people do not prioritize singles year-round, maybe they do them year-round, but they don't prioritize them year-round, it's very common to see a peaking block look very different from an average intensity perspective than any block prior. And my video on fatigue singles, if you haven't watched that and going through the case study of Waskar, goes into this concept deeper and gives a full breakdown and case study. And I'm not going to overly talk about fatigue singles here because that's just a singular tool. By no means fixes the entirety of the issues. So there's three main reasons, typically, I see for rep work average intensity dropping during a peaking block. First one is there's no rep work top sets and only back offs. So you go from typically doing a top rep set and then back offs to now you just do a single and then back offs. Well, that's going to change things. You're no longer hitting a heavy rep set. Second, the back off average intensity significantly drops from a big adrenaline dump after a heavy single. A lot of times people are putting a lot more kind of focus, adrenaline, and oomph into those singles, and they have these really, really big drop-offs. And depending on how it's programmed, you might have a lifter auto-regulate too far down, which I'll show in an example. And number three, the back-off sets are programmed off a percentage drop, and average intensity of back-off work jumps higher than normal, which could be for a multitude of reasons, but one big reason, which is what we're going to talk about here in a little bit, of the higher intensities earlier in the block. So a lot of times you change the progression rate and you're going heavier than you do during a normal block. And so therefore, if the percent drop is based off of that, you're now doing heavier back off. So either way, let's go through some examples here. So example block layout is you have over a 3-block span. That we're going to use is you have a primary day, a top set of 3 at an 8 RPE, and then a 14% drop. So just kind of an idea of what I'm doing here. It's an 8% drop for a back off, and then it's another 6% because of the rep change here. You have a top set of 2 at an 8 RPE, and then 3 by 5. So we're just keeping these back offs the same. Again, this goes back to kind of my video on on the peaking series and my updated block or approach to block periodization. So if you want more information on kind of this, make sure to check out those videos. But 17% drop, again, that's just because we have an additional rep here. And then 1 by 1 at 8 RPE, and then we have a 3 by 5 at 20% drop, again, because now we have a 4 rep difference. So what does this look like? Even if we're just programming it just straight up off of numbers, and I have RPE here to make it easy, but let's just do the numbers that would correlate. So if we do 1 set of 3 at an 8 RPE, and then I'm going off of the assumption of a 200 kilo max. That's what I'm going to be using for all these examples. So that would be 86.3% based off of a generalized percentage chart. That's 172.5. And then with the 14% drop, 150 kilos for 3 sets of 5. Gives you an average intensity of 77.81. And now how I calculated this, if you're looking at the statistics of it, I'm calculated as each set, not the total reps, because I think there's some iffy thing, or not some iffy things, but some caveats here of like how you actually calculate average intensity and what really pans out. So I'm doing it per set. So you can see I have 1 set here that's going based off of that 172, and then 3 sets based off of the 150 there. So next block. 1 by 2, 177.5, 150 for the back offs, just keeping those the same for this example. Doesn't mean your back offs are always the same, but just for example, I am. You have 78.44% average intensity. Then we get to the peaking block. We keep the same back offs, but now we're at the single. This isn't necessarily rep work anymore, so I'm in this example, I'm not counting it. So I'm looking at the rep work we're doing. Here, we have a big drop off in average intensity. We have the single and then a 3 by 5, and the average intensity drops off because all of our rep work is back off work route. We're not doing any like single. And in reality, a better example probably could even be if we did like 5s and then 4s and then did a single for a top set after not doing anything below like 5s or 4s. But my point of being here is that we eventually get to the point where we prioritize rep work, and then we start prioritizing singles, and then all of our rep work volume takes a big drop. And this is probably the least of the issues. You might see a little bit of a change. The bigger issue is the next 2 examples. And that next one is back offset average intensity drops significantly from big adrenaline dump after a very heavy single. Let's use the example that everything's RPE. It's not percent drop, it's not percentage base. We have a top set of 3 at an 8, and then a 3 by 5 at like a 5 to 6 RPE each set, which would be about 150 kilos. So again, exact same, just using the execution, exact same as these first 2. But then let's take the example of 2 things. One, we're going to be going heavier during the peaking block and pushing a heavier single than we normally do and going up to 9 RPE versus 8. And then 2, this is a type of lifter who gets a huge drop off after that single on their back off sets in the sense of like that adrenaline dump. Well, now we're doing 190 for that single versus 180, 185, and we're really pushing that. We have a big adrenaline dump, and now 5 to 6 RPE puts us at 142. Well, now we're taking this is where we're starting to see a big difference. This, probably not a huge difference. This is where we start to see a bigger difference when we actually see the execution, because what's written on paper doesn't always mean that's exactly how it's going to play out. Lifter psychology has a big element within how programming is actually executed. And so a big portion of programming as a coach is organizing training in a way that elicits the execution you're looking for. And so in this example, this lifter, they're executing the program, but because of the way they approach it and the psychological components, they're getting a big drop off in rep work average intensity because of that adrenaline dump after these heavy singles that they're really putting all their effort into, and not necessarily being fatigued, but just again, the big adrenaline dump mentally that a lot of times comes from that. And so we see the back off sets have a big drop in average intensity, and that changes the program. And then lastly, just as an example, we have back off sets are programmed off of a percent drop, and average intensity of the back off work jumps higher. So now this is the opposite of this one. This is where it goes way up. So let's say you're doing top set of 3 and then a 14% drop. Again, exact same here for just the model we're looking at. But then we get to the peaking block. We're like, all right, it's the final week before we taper. We're going to max out here, and then we're going to do a 20% drop from that. Well, you max out at 10 RPE, even though maybe it was programmed at a 9. You go to 200 kilos. You do the 20% drop, just like it says to do here. But now that 20% drop gets you at 162.5, and it jacks up your average intensity. And this is a way harder workout than your normal actual progression of like block 1, block 2, and even like if we normalize block 3 to the same exact kind of setup of RPE and progression rate, big old jump there. Completely changes things. So again, we need to really make sure we're organizing training in a way that helps to make sure rep work average intensity stays fairly similar and doesn't have big fluctuations for what we normally do in the blocks leading into that peaking block. And then the third thing I want to look at is the top 3 reasons why I find that peaking blocks tend to go wrong is hitting higher absolute and relative intensities earlier in the block than normal. So absolute meaning just the load on the bar, and relative meaning like the RPE and the actual exertion to failure or proximity to failure. So this goes back to a bit to pushing singles, but the common thing I see is a different progression plan on singles during the peaking block. So maybe a lifter does singles pretty commonly, but for the most part, they stay in like a 6 to 8 RPE range during a normal block, and that's what they normally do if they're not peaking. But then peaking, all of a sudden we're going to push to 10 RPE, which is different. Or you have a lifter who rarely does singles, so how singles are implemented progression-wise is entirely different than their normal block progression, which is what I'm going to show in this example. And then lastly, the debate could even get to, should you even max out singles during a peaking block? That gets into some nuance, and I mean, I have a lot of lifters I have that don't even max out singles because it changes too much of what we normally do. And within that, likely bench is not an issue, but some lifters get very disproportionately fatigued on max singles, in particular deadlift. So again, a lot of things that go into managing the progression rate to more normalize of what you would do. Looking at the normal block progression model, we're just using the same block 1 that we've been using from the other examples here of the 1x3 and 3x5. Let's say your normal block progression rate is you have a 4-week block and it goes a 5, 6, 7, 8 in the sense of the RPE. And then we have 2 examples here of even a percent drop, which is using the same exact percentage or similar percentage we used before, be a 10% drop plus 6% because of the rep change, so 16% total. And then on top of that, I gave what the percentage would be of that if we were actually just doing just percentage-based programming, so 61, 64, 67, or 70. But this is our normal, block progression. But what we see very, very often is once we get to a peaking block, that changes and we start pushing those singles at a progression that is higher than we normally do. So 1, we start at a higher RPE, so higher relative intensity. And then 2, just because it's a single versus a triple, the absolute intensity is higher. And so now we start progressing, we go and max out week 4, and this is very, very different than this. This is going to have a different response in what we see fatigue-wise and progression-wise, as well as even a bigger issue if this is how it's being programmed. If this is a percent drop and not percentage-based or RPE-based, the actual percent drop off of this is taking a big jump from what you're doing here, a la example number 3, where we're having a big difference in that percent drop because of how much of a higher RPE that's going to. So that would be an example of where you might want to be doing percentage-based stuff to control that progression while the singles are going heavier. But either way, I see very, very often that lifters will do something like this come a peaking block, and by week 4, they just don't feel as good as they normally do. Well, it's because we went heavier, absolute intensity and relative intensity earlier in the block than we normally do. And so there's a multitude of ways that you can fix this, but there's one, you can maybe not fully max out depending on the lifter you have. You don't have to max out every single lift in the gym and go to a 10 RPE. Or 2, maybe you're controlling this progression where you're gonna make sure that it's gonna start a little bit lighter and you're gonna make a bigger jumps weekly, or you're just gonna make a bigger jump into that final week versus having the same exact 1 RPE progression model. It might be 5, 6, 7, 9, and not fully max out and make a bigger jump into that weeks 4 to have the same exact week 1, 2, 3 progression model, because you know this weeks 1 through 3 does a good job of leading in and setting things up good for week 4. So I usually won't change this progression. I will just change that week 4 to be a little bit heavier because I don't want to change what leads into what makes that final week feeling strong. So that concludes the video on the top 3 reasons I see peaking blocks going wrong. And that is from overly periodizing a secondary day, from having too much change in the average intensity of your rep work, and then lastly, changing your progression rate and starting with higher absolute or relative intensities earlier in the block than you would normally do. So I somewhat alluded to some of the how to fixes, but this was more of a video to show the whys. If you want the full encompassing how to fix these issues, again, that is the peaking series on Powerlifting Now, which is the reason why it's 5 hours long, is because of how much really needs to go into this to explain everything. So I'd make sure to check that out. But hopefully at least this gave you a good idea of some small little things that can make some major differences in the peaking process. And if you're having issues with the actual training during peaking, not the taper, but the actual training in that final block, not going as planned and how it normally does, look at these 3 things. Look at that secondary day, look at the average intensity of the rep work, and look at your general progression rate and how heavy you're starting. And if it's overly different from what you normally do, there's a good chance that's the reason why training isn't going as expected and as planned, because you're changing things from what normally works. So if you have any questions, make sure to comment down below. If you're not subscribed, make sure to hit that button, give it a like, share it if you have any friends who you think would benefit from this. But until next time, peace.